Okay, so we'll make a start. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for this skill set presentation, exploring the practicalities of community engagement. Please drop me your name and where you're from into the chat. I'm going to try and keep my eye on the chat, and my colleague Megan is with us today in the background, so Megan can flag any key questions or anything you want to raise as the session's going on. I'm also going to give you access to a Menti in a moment. If you haven't used Menti before, there's a link, and it's got a link to a couple of questions. We sent these out in advance, but just a few things to consider around challenges to do with community engagement. And there's a question on there which we'll be exploring together a little bit later on. Just let a few more people in. Hi, everyone. Thank you for popping your name and where you're from in the chat. Lovely stuff. Okay. A few more people to let in. Fab. So hello, everyone. My name's Carly. I'm a senior consultant at the Audience Agency. I have a background as a theatre practitioner working in community settings. So I'll draw on some of that practice and also some work with clients more recently at the Audience Agency. I'm a white woman in my late 30s. I have wavy brown hair and I'm wearing a green jumper and a black cardigan. And for those who need it, closed captions are available for this session. Just to say as well, I'm trying to sort of keep my eye on the chat and things like that, and so is Megan. But if you've got a question or anything you want to ask, just shout up. I don't mind being interrupted at all. And I'm really keen as well that this session is quite interactive. So it'd be great if you could share examples, and we can draw on people's knowledge in the room as well. Just a bit about the Audience Agency, if you haven't come across us before. We're not a commercial consultancy, we're a charity. So we aim to support organisations to increase their relevance, reach and resilience. And many of our team members have worked in arts and cultural settings previously, so we really understand the reality and the practicalities and some of the challenges that come with that. So do check out our website. We have a range of different skill sets that are free to access, and there are different tools on the website which you might want to delve into. So I'm just popping an outline of the session here. We'll be exploring community engagement today, and some of the steps that you could take to better connect with, learn from and collaborate with your local communities. We'll be exploring this through a people-centred lens. So thinking about how you can better build your offer with people's interests and needs at the centre. So as I've said, there'll be opportunities for discussion, so we can hear from people's experiences. Looking at the Menti board that people have completed so far, there are people that are completely new to community engagement and some experienced practitioners in the room. So it'd be good if we can sort of draw on people's examples. And yeah, like I've said, use the chat. Feel free to do that. I've just popped the QR code to the Menti board here. If you can scan it on your phone, and Megan will also pop a link to it in the chat. So there are just a couple of questions on there. It's like a short survey. So you might want to access that now ahead of us coming to it later on. So the first thing I thought we'd explore in this session is what's led you here in terms of your thinking, and what considerations might be useful before embarking on a community project, for example. So if you're at the beginning of your journey in terms of wanting to engage local communities or groups that might be a priority for your organisation, there might be some mapping involved to understand your context in greater detail. So an exercise around building your knowledge to better understand local demographics and also test some of your assumptions. So looking at what prejudices or notions might exist within yourself or your organisation is really important. That can include questioning what we think we know about certain groups and why they might be difficult to engage for whatever reason. Checking population data and ward profiles to draw together demographic data can also be useful. So there's a tool that the Audience Agency offer, which I'll mention in just a moment, but there are different things available as well. So ward profile data, there's census data available, so you can draw on that to get a better understanding of who's actually living in your locality. So in addition to that quantitative demographic data, that should also be supplemented when you're thinking about getting to know your community with just walking and talking and getting out and about and just taking the temperature of different places. So thinking through different digital spaces that you know exist and that people might interact with locally, and also physical spaces as well. So getting a feel for where people gather, in what scenarios are they gathering in certain areas and so on. And finally, mapping your contacts. So this is a really useful place to start at the beginning of your journey. So who are your existing partners and connectors? For example, schools, youth centres, and where might you need to build and grow your networks? So I just mentioned this, our population profile reports. These are a paid for service at the Audience Agency, but they're really useful in drawing together data, census data, and information around people's cultural preferences and engagement through our audience spectrum data. So these are available on the website if you want to check that out. But they can be useful if you're wanting to create a new area of work, or you're interested in delving deeper into what you know about certain pockets of the community. These can be really useful. And this set of questions is something that I use quite a lot in my work with clients. So it's just useful to reflect on when you're thinking about community engagement, how the engagement with that particular group links to your purpose as a practitioner or an organisation. So for example, if you want to work with more young people, well, how does that link to your values as an organisation and what you're trying to do? And then you can talk through these questions with colleagues, which can be useful. So what do you currently offer that may attract them? What might be relevant and meaningful to them currently? And what might you have to develop in order to be more relevant? And then finally on here, a useful question: how will engagement be sustained and embedded? That's something we're going to look at later in the session, but legacy is useful to have in your mind right at the start of your project planning. And I just wanted to touch on language briefly. And the reason for this is quite often we see terms such as marginalised, excluded, used in the arts sector. And these terms can be problematic because it suggests some sort of a deficit on the group or individual's part. So a lack of knowledge or a lack of cultural capital. Whereas quite often the reason that people aren't engaging is because of the barriers that we put up as an organisation, physical factors, or because what we're offering just isn't relevant to them for whatever reason. So it's just useful to think through this language. The way we talk about communities as well, both in the sense of the copy that we're putting out about particular projects, but also the way we see particular groups is useful to consider. So it's essential to group people together and segment them in order for us to target our offers. But it's just remembering that people aren't a homogenous group and that we're all intersectional and nuanced in our identities. So that's just something to consider when we're making sort of assumptions about groups. It's also important to steer away from generalizations and avoid terms in copy and so on, like I've said, that we might put out that describes groups as, say, deprived or neat young people who are developing new skills. It's just something to keep in the back of your mind, because quite often we see this in community engagement. So we're going to take a look at now building networks and connections. So this section really explores what I think is at the centre of community engagement, and that is relationship building. And this is something that is going to be vital, whatever stage of the journey that you're on in terms of engagement. And it's worth just having in the back of your mind that this is an ongoing, everyday practice. So community engagement, building networks and connections should be absolutely seen as something your organisation does and keeps on top of and nurtures, rather than it being something that's a flash in the pan. So seeing that as being ongoing, and seeing it as being something that's informal in a sense as well. So it doesn't have to be about going out and having a formal meeting with a potential partner, but it can be chatting to people in a local cafe, getting to local events happening with your family, and seeing yourself as a participant in an existing cultural ecology. So somebody said in the Mentor, in response to the question, what do you hope to gain from the workshop? Their response was, we're about to move home and our aim is to embed ourselves in the local community. And that really speaks to this point that I'm making. And I thought it was brilliant, whoever said that we're all participants in our communities, whether we work or live there. And I think that's at the heart of it, that it's about building connections and relationships for relationships' sake. So just have that in the back of your mind. This diagram is a really helpful way to consider relationship building, which is time consuming. But it's part of, like I've said, a sort of continual process. So the axis coming down represent maybe a distinct project or an event or a gathering that's been developed in its own right. It's time constrained. And then the line across the top there, the diagonal line, represents the ongoing nurturing and maintaining of a relationship. So they both rely on each other in a way. The projects or gatherings or events or whatever they might be sort of provide momentum and keep the relationship going. But it's often that space in between that needs some attention. And it seems like a basic concept, but actually I think it's the key to sort of meaningful engagement and partnership working. So when you've delivered an event and you have made or wrapped up a project or whatever it is, think about what's next and build in time to continually sort of reconnect with that group of people or that person. So it could be a visit to their centre if it's a pre-existing group. It could be that you attend their coffee morning. It could be that you're sending them a follow-up email. So don't see this as sort of time wasted, but it's part of keeping that relationship warm. This second point, what do you have to give as well as to gain through these relationships, can be quite important. So as cultural organisations or artists, we're quite often wanting people to come to us to participate in something, to come to our performance or workshop. And it's useful to think, well, what can you give as well? So how can you maybe connect with somebody for the sake of that group? If they invite you to their AGM or they invite you to, for example, a school fair, can you reciprocate that showing up for them? And quite often these things we see as being time consuming, but they will pay dividends because it's about supporting that cultural ecology in your local area. And also it feels reciprocal then. And finally, just on this point around nurturing relationships, who holds these relationships that you're creating? So often this can be the responsibility of one person who goes out and builds up these contacts, delivers this work. And there's a risk that if that person leaves, then the connection might be lost. So where possible, make this work organisational. So if you have volunteers, for example, working with you, inform volunteers and staff of a group that you engage in, or who might be attending, and really centre your organisational practice, centre this as part of your organisational practice, I should say, so that a rapport is developed between different staff members and groups. I'm going to stop talking in a minute. I'll just talk through this last slide for this section. It's just to give you an example of a relationship that I developed with a particular group when I was head of learning at the Coliseum Theatre in Oldham. So I worked there for about 10 years and I lived in an area of Oldham that was changing rapidly with emerging communities. There was friction and hostility between local residents of white, South Asian and Roma heritage. So going back to the point that I made earlier around those key questions, so thinking about your values as an organisation and why you want to engage particular groups. For me in the learning department at the Coliseum, I was sort of aware of these problems being a resident in the area, but I also was doing work in schools, so I could see some of the challenges that Roma children and young people were facing in terms of them feeling very segregated. So for the Coliseum, we wanted to be an inclusive space that was relevant to all local communities. And so I began to think about developing a relationship that brought these communities closer to our offer, whether that be in the building or whether that be outside of the building. So where did I start in building connections and how? I initially spoke to a housing officer. So there's a social housing provider working in this area of Grenicas in Oldham. And I knew of this housing provider. We'd worked together before. And we sort of got together and collectively established who were our contacts working in this area. And we knew of a Roma-led charity that was working in Oldham called Kaskasan. And we spent a lot of time with Kaskasan just really listening to their challenges. And that took time in itself. We built relationships with the director there called Juice. And the Roma community at the time were facing lots of problems, which were exacerbated through Brexit and so on. So we really listened and we made sure that we were transparent in terms of what we were trying to discover and what we were trying to hope to do. And then we just literally walked the streets and talked to local people. Juice came along with us to those discovery sessions, I suppose, in a sense, where we were just walking and talking to people. And his presence there was really crucial because there was a lot of hostility towards us, as this community were understandably quite nervous about engaging with services. And gradually we started to look at where young people were gathering and got a sense of what they might be interested in. And we delivered activities in those spaces. And that led to delivering more activities in green spaces, at local events, before eventually co-creating activities with these groups. So we had a youth club for these young people, and a women's group were eventually formed. So it did take time, but I think at the core of this was just getting out and about and meeting people where they were. But critically with this work, I think it's important to note that it comes with a certain sense of, it comes with a responsibility. Because having built that trust with this group, we were asked for support in accessing services such as health services, engaging with the police, support with housing, and you have to have a commitment to being able to support and care for these groups, particularly that might be vulnerable for whatever reason. So that was kind of critical to this piece of work. We had to be ready, available, and take a really careful approach in what we were doing. So absolutely key to this project was the mutually beneficial and trusting relationship with Kaskazan, the Roma-led charity, and for the community showing up in their spaces and being really present and really listening and acting on that. And in terms of the creative activities, it was sort of street art that we delivered with families, to the families of the young people we were engaging. And for the young people, it was sort of different activities that we could deliver out and about, before we got to know more about what they wanted to do and where they wanted to go with us next. So I just wanted to share that as sort of to illustrate, I suppose, the process that we went through in order to engage this particular community. But I'll stop talking now. Has anybody got any examples they'd like to share of ways that they might have connected and built a relationship with a group in their local community, where they're not necessarily an existing or pre-formed group? Because we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But has anybody else sort of been on a particularly long journey with a group, maybe? Caroline.
So it wasn't actually in response to your question. It was more a response to your example. I think it's a fantastic example. When you referenced, obviously, this raised a lot of other challenges with linking to local services. Did you have that local service buy-in? Did they, because there's, in the work that I've done before, sometimes that joining up where a local authority has been a little naive in their approach. And I was just thinking, how much support did you have from those local services from the off, really?
That's a really good question. I think initially probably not that much buy-in. And I think it was something that we realised, that how much this work was going to require us to delve away from creative practice and actually be looking at more fundamental things that these people are asking for. So we built those connections, and the housing officer that I was working with was really useful in that sense. So had those connections. But it was something that we had to develop and pivot really quickly. Yeah. So I think also, well, I talk about this in legacy later on, but thinking through signposting before you've started a project could be useful. And I think if we'd have anticipated some of the challenges that this group group we're facing, we might have thought through some of those that signposting beforehand. But thanks for that, Caroline. That's a really good question. Did somebody else have the hand up then? Is there anything anybody else would like to just add to the discussion at this point? Or any questions anybody's got? Clara? Oh, you're just on mute.
Hi, sorry also for being a little bit late. I was just gonna ask about something you said a little bit earlier, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
You were talking about how to kind of spread out the contact with different local groups to kind of build that more organizationally. But I think in my experience, it's also quite hard to kind of keep that trust as well with the organization without it feeling like the contact is kind of being bounced around between people. So do you have any more like practical tips on how you kind of build that in?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. That's a really good point. So in terms of having one contact for a group, and then yeah, I think, well, when I was working in the learning department, I held a lot of those relationships, and I did have the trust of certain community groups and community group leaders. But I think in terms of if you're a building-based organisation, for example, it's letting staff know about that work that's going on, which sadly quite often, as we know, it gets siloed. Letting staff know about the groups that you're engaging with, and when you're bringing them into the building, making sure that other people are meeting them, so they're seeing different faces, and so that even if you're holding that relationship and you're responsible for that, that they get used to other faces in the building, that there's a sense that they're being welcomed by others as well. So that's sort of what I was saying there. And it feeling more shared. I hope that's useful, Clara.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you.
I'll just move over to Ali's question or comment.
Hi there. Yes,
Yeah.
we've had barriers where we've had fantastic projects that have been taken up by parents directly through our advertising, but schools have been reticent in promoting or letting parents know about the projects. And we understand why, because they've got their own agenda, which is the school curriculum to deal with. So we can't ask them to be ambassadors for a group they haven't worked with a lot or known about for very long. So what we did to try and engage them was to get some feedback from the parents and say to the parents, can you go back to your schools and tell them how wonderful this was? We then used some of the parents' feedback to go to our local councillors. So we were building up testimonials from other people that we could then put into our next project, that we could then go back to the schools and say, this is what other people have said about working with our organisation. And for the first time ever, we've actually had a much bigger uptake with schools engaging with us. So it was down to testimonials and feedback of current users that helped us to endorse future activity with schools.
Thanks for sharing that, Ali. That's really interesting. And that's something that might be useful, just as more a general, something more general that you could do in terms of capturing reflections from groups that you're engaging with it within other strands and through other projects and so on. That's really useful, using that as a promotional tool. Thanks for sharing that, Ali. Phil?
Hi, just to share something that we've been doing to make sure that all the organisation is involved. We offer very highly discounted tickets to some of our community groups, and there's often people in the front of house who work front of house who want to work in the community and education department, but there's not lots of opportunities. So we set up one person who would greet the community group as they came in and then talk to them afterwards, and also act as a host if there are any actors or creatives who wanted to talk to the group as well. And that introduced them. They became another face of the building. And you're right, because if one person ends up just being the only contact, you become the building to a number of people, and you really need to share that out. And this one has worked really well because it plays off the strengths of the person that we're working with, that we're kind of employing. It's extending their skills, and it extends the number of people that the community group is interacting with. It also means I don't have to work every night of the week as well as during the day, which is also a help as well. So yeah, I just thought I'd share that.
Phil, that's great. Thank you. Hopefully that's useful to you, Clara, as well. That's a really great example of, like you said, Phil, not becoming the face of a building, but letting other people engage in that as well, because it's joyful engaging with different groups and welcoming people in or delivering work with people. So having other people set up to do that, that's a brilliant addition. Thank you, Phil. Sally?
Hi there. Yeah, I was just thinking of that example that someone gave of asking parents for feedback. And there's a bit of a problem when you're a freelancer, that you work with lots of different groups, and say you work with an institution, but you also do your own work, and say you work with families in one area, and how you sort of pass that experience, you know, because you can't sort of use the institution's sort of feedback as your feedback, you know, but you've had the experience. So sort of if anybody has any ideas of ways to do that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I wonder, could you ask, could they share that with you, Sally, and sort of still use it if you've delivered a session or a project?
Yeah. I suppose it's just that the feedback comes through the institution, and you don't necessarily ask for it, so it's not in the format that you're going to use necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good question. If anybody's got any ideas or suggestions for that, do drop it in the chat. I'll have a look at the chat in just a moment. Thank you for everybody who contributed something then. Oh, Catherine, we'll come to Catherine, and then we will move on to the next section. Catherine, hiya.
Yeah, just it's slightly out of the remit in a way, but it's just to say that I live in the King's Cross area, and we used to have a breakfast network of community organisations, but that also had the educational institutions, arts, cultural institutions, and they were all invited, and also the local community were invited. And it was a way of communicating about what each other were doing, how we were working with people, the community. And it also happened in each other's buildings. So you had, you'd set up some croissants and coffee, people would come, it would be before work. The community were invited, and you had like I suppose you call it parish news in a way. People would stand up, talk about what they were doing, and it really worked very well. It was a really good hub and also you invite local councillors, and people come or they don't come, but it happened on a bi-monthly basis. It wasn't too laborious. I mean, obviously you have to have some kind of central contacts, but it did work really well, and people went around to each other's buildings as well if they had a building or a space, a venue, and got to know the area, the people. And so those conversations started to become informal and formal. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there in the mix.
Catherine, thank you for that. That's really useful, and it feeds into something that I mentioned throughout this presentation around, I've mentioned it before, that your offer is part of a wider cultural and creative ecology, and how can you support and nourish other areas of that? Because participants will move, community members might move across projects, and that sort of that coming together, like you said, and a hub, sharing ideas, what's everybody up to. There might be some nice signposting opportunities, and just the culture that creates around sharing and learning. Sounds fantastic. So thank you for sharing that, Catherine. I'm just going to move us along. There'll be other opportunities where we can stop and have a chat. So I've put a link to the Menti if you can access this. But this section is around making an invitation. So the case study that I sort of described then was based on sort of long-term engagement. It involved going directly to spaces where young people gathered. But if you're planning on holding an event or a performance, etc., either in your space or in another community space, it's useful to consider how we make an invitation and what that invitation might look like. So I'm going to invite you to access that Menti board now. And I think it's question 3 on the board. And question 3 asks, when was the last time you did something for the first time? So if you could fill that in, that would be great. Can I just check, can everybody access that board? If you can't, you're welcome to pop your answer in the chat. What I'm going to suggest now is that we take a 10-minute break. If you could kindly add your responses before you go off and grab a brew, that'll just give me time in the break to set that up on my screen. And also when you're grabbing a cup of tea or whatever, if you could get a pen and a piece of paper, that would be brilliant. We're going to be having a go at an activity shortly. When people ask me to get a pen, I think, are you joking, mate? I have no idea where a pen is. So I hope you might have one to hand or one not too far away. So we'll take a 10-minute pause now and come back at 2:20. Thank you, everyone. I'll just give people a couple more minutes and then we'll have a look at this Menti slide. I don't know if anybody's ever used Menti before in an online workshop, but I find it so hard flicking between the different screens. So it was good to just have a pause there and work out what I was doing.
Hey Carly, it's Megan. I'm sure you've seen already, but we've got a couple of people putting their new experiences in the chat as well.
Ooh, fab.
Some of them sound frankly terrifying.
Thanks, Megan. I'll just give people 1 more minute, as I said, 20 past. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to make a start on this next section. So I asked just before the break, when was the last time you did something new? What was it? And how did you feel? So we got lots of really interesting thoughts on the Menti board. We've got examples of people people trying something new at work, so based on community connections, and then some people saying, which I've seen a few times now, that they've not tried something new for a while and they feel sad about that. We've got some examples of people going to new yoga classes, starting to learn crochet. People saying they're feeling sort of nervous about trying things new, or fearing that they'll get something wrong. What else have we got? People are trying, people have started new jobs, feeling nervous about going to new places. Somebody took part in a wild singing workshop, which was to form connection through voice and nature. It was uplifting and empowering. That sounds fab. And I'll just have a look in the chat. Ali said, talking to local businesses, handing out flyers, community notice boards. Catherine has said, at work, trying out thank you cards, to say thank you to donors instead of a letter. And on a personal note, becoming a stepmother, learning astrology. Somebody travelling to Saudi, hiya Aiden, to run a photography storytelling experience. That sounds amazing. First big public facing project. Getting and working with a DYCP grant. Performing solo in an industrial museum. Trying a new approach to making drama in schools, felt great. Return from mat leave into a new role at work over the past year. Lots of first times as a mum too. Thanks for sharing that, Laura. So it'd be great to just unpack some of that now. I'm just going to stop screen sharing that for a moment. So in thinking about when you tried something new, it's good to put yourselves in the shoes of participants or people that you're inviting into your space or to take part in your activities. A frequent sort of theme there was that people felt nervous about trying something new or attending something for the first time or getting it wrong. So we're going to just explore this in some more detail now. Just bear with me, I'll just screen share the PowerPoint again. Okay, can you see my slides there, everyone? Can somebody just shout?
We've got your slides. We'll have your notes there as well, visible, Carly.
Okay. Sorry, everyone, just bear with me a second. Really hard to do this when you can't see the Zoom. Is it just me who's still really bad at doing this?
Definitely not.
Okay. There we go. Right, I think I've got it. Right, I will just make this into a slideshow now. Sorry, right, here we go. Is that better? Can everyone see?
Perfect.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'll just skip through. I set myself up there. I was just saying how I'm rubbish at oscillating between like different programs. Okay. So in thinking about trying something new for the first time, I just wanted to draw your attention to this fantastic book. My colleague Natel got me into this book, which is called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. And it centres on thinking through or rethinking how we gather and what it means to gather. So what are the conditions that we're creating when we facilitate a gathering? And even just thinking about that term gathering to describe a sort of workshop or event really shifted my thinking around how I could make better invitations. So thinking about how people are feeling when they're coming to things for the first time, or some of their expectations and anticipations about doing something new. So Priya Parker says, gathering with intention and care is a life-affirming practice. And one of the questions that she asks is, when was the last time you went to a gathering and it felt really nourishing, really enjoyable? And that question, I think, is useful for us as practitioners to take into our community context. So, for example, getting an invitation to a dinner party, this is one of the things that she explores. My expectations of what that will be could be completely different to somebody else's. So I might expect that I'll come smartly dressed, I'll bring a bottle of wine, there'll be food, there'll be dancing. Somebody else's expectations around what we're eating, what we're drinking, not drinking, and the activities the evening will centre on could be really different. So thinking through expectations and setting the agenda is really useful. So this can include really key practical things that we might take for granted, such as getting there, where to go when we get there, who's going to greet the person, the facilities, etc. So that plays into what Phil was saying about having a host for the events at was it the Malvern Theatre, Phil? So thinking through that and what to expect is really useful. And it's not just useful to groups with particular lived experiences, but it's useful, as we've illustrated through the Menti, to all of us. We're all going to be in a situation when we're trying something new. So just thinking through that can make the event or the activity feel more inclusive. So moving on now to creating a welcoming and inclusive space. There are just some key questions here. So where, when and how? Do activities have to be delivered in your space? If engaging new visitors, what times and spaces might be most appropriate? Who's there to greet them? What are the tangible and invisible barriers? So consider visitors' journeys, crossing the threshold. What does that invisible threshold look like? Whether that is taking a journey across a town and to a different part of town they might not be familiar with, or to simply walking through the door and not knowing where the entrance is and so on. Moving around the building. And crucially as well, how do they feel represented in that building? So is representation an issue in terms of welcoming new groups? And I've just popped a few tools and resources there, which we'll share afterwards as well. So these are quite useful for thinking through creating the conditions for an inclusive environment. So there's the Dementia Friendly Arts Guide, Starling's Creating Neurodiverse Friendly Spaces. There's best practice checklist and audits from Shape Arts and Stage Text as well. So I'll share those. So just moving on now to working with existing groups. So we've talked a lot about activities where we might go out and engage with groups and how we might invite individuals to activities. But what are some of the things to consider when we're working with pre-formed groups? Within your sort of mapping exercise that we talked about earlier, you might have established local groups that are operating. And these can be really useful people to connect with, particularly group leaders, because you've got a very captive audience for your activities. The Audience Agency, in partnership with the Centre for Cultural Value, recently developed this resource that's on screen called Supporting Everyday Creativity. And it explores how cultural organisations and artists can support everyday creativity within the community rather than feeling as if they have to sort of own and hold these activities. So how can you support people's existing work, and how can you sort of be flexible and responsive to groups' interests and needs, so it being very much led by their creative practice and existing expertise. So speaking to groups and asking how they might be interested in collaborating is a good place to start. And I saw somebody had put in the chat a similar point. Let me just dig that out. Visiting new community groups and discussing about challenges they are facing and working together to implement creativity through arts and theatre. So that was Nip. Thank you for sharing that. So that very much speaks to this idea of, rather than parachuting in and having a pre-made programme, you're really trying to establish what's there already and how can you complement that offer. It does involve, as I've said, sort of being flexible. So it might be that groups meet at existing times, for example, and in spaces. And it's also about moving away from that deficit way of thinking to a more asset-based approach. So how can we collaborate and support an existing group's interests? I've just got a case study to share here. Sorry, my screen's frozen. There we go. So as part of this research, we spoke to Miriam Story from Eltham Library in London, and the library very much supports and works with and alongside communities. So alongside core library activities, staff encourage the local community to bring their ideas into the space. They ask what creative practice already exists in the community and how can we connect and support those activities rather than trying to reinvent or invent provision. So Miriam said, which is just brilliant, unless you're willing to move furniture and make brews, then what's your role? And the reason I loved that quote so much was it's about rethinking our space as well and how we can collaborate with groups on their terms. It might be that they have a need for a space to meet. How can you facilitate that and be working with groups to support their activities? Miriam also notes that attending events in the community and having a presence outside the library is an ongoing practice. No conversation is wasted. So this speaks to what we were talking about earlier around building and nurturing connections. And I just wanted to touch on this point around closing a workshop or project carefully. So much of what we've explored focuses on sort of initiating activities, making invitations and new connections. But project closure is something that isn't explored often enough, I feel. So planning a soft landing for community participants can be really important, and being really clear when a project is finishing and thinking through that legacy as we've talked about. So ask groups how they'd like to be kept in touch with. So that could be creating a list of emails from a session you've ran or a project you've delivered, and compiling and sending out a really simple email that might detail upcoming opportunities, news about other projects and celebrations and so on. And what I've found is that can be really useful for sort of cross-group working. So you get this lovely kind of cross-pollination of groups when you might invite them to a free event or activity that's being led and that's been delivered by another group. And quite often other community participants might attend that. So again, this idea of creating a community around the work. and signposting, which we touched on before in terms of engaging the Roma group. So what useful signposts can you establish as the project's running so that people have an exit strategy, other things that they can move on to? And I think it was Catherine, apologies if it wasn't Catherine, who shared that lovely example of the hub that they've established locally. Going to talk through involving people in decision making, and this is generally good practice in community engagement, and there are all sorts of resources around co-creation and co-production. However, I wanted to offer some simpler suggestions in today's workshop, as co-creation is a whole other skill set, and done meaningfully, it's brilliant, but it's resource and time heavy. And having looked at the Menti beforehand, I know many people are sort of taking their first steps into this, and it's time consuming co-creation. So I'll touch on something that still involves people in decision making, but it's probably less, like I've said, sort of time and resource heavy. So I'm showing here a table that illustrates a spectrum. And this is something that the audience agency produced that I find really, really useful to make reference to. So it's a spectrum of involvement and decision making. So at the top, it describes participants' level of involvement, and below that, how participants are engaged. So, for example, present, represented, involved, empowered. And on the left, participants are invited to take part in preset activities. And then on the right of the scale, that illustrates participants being directly involved in co-creation as active leaders or decision makers. And it's not always appropriate or welcomed to push participants through this spectrum as if it's a pipeline, which I'd argue some of the narrative around co-creation doesn't always recognise. If you're an organisation or practitioner who's maybe at the start of this journey, as we've talked about, making invitations to taster events and participatory workshops might be a good first step, and then consultation, which we're going to look at now. So that's about obviously consulting with groups to better build an offer that represents their interests and needs. If you didn't grab a pen before, it would be great if you could do that. This slide is about consultation, so I'm going to run through that, and then we're going to try a couple of activities which might be useful for you. So if you're thinking about engaging groups in consultation, it's worth thinking about who specifically you want to hear from and what it is that you want to know. In addition, being really transparent about why you're asking and how much influence those people will have. So if the idea is that you're going to collate ideas together and that you will consider implementing some of these into your new programming, then be clear about that. And you'll want to consider remunerating participants. So if you are planning on asking people for their time and expertise, remuneration and putting some money aside to make sure that their costs are covered and that their time is covered is really important. Consultation can happen in different ways. So it could be that it's a drop-in session that's attached to a pre-existing event in the community where you're inviting people's feedback, or it could be a structured session that you deliver with a particular group. So there are a couple of examples of activities here to try. So the first one illustrated in this picture here is where do you stand? So this is suitable for if you are working with a group that's already pre-formed or that's come together for consultation. And the premise of it is you're asking a question on a scale. So in this picture, I'm delivering this exercise with students from a college based in Leeds, and we were consulting with them around their perceptions of the British Library. So I like to do this in a circle where I put a bunch of keys in the middle, and I set strongly agree as being far away from the keys and strongly agree as being right near the keys. And on a line, you do that side to side. So you can start this activity by throwing in a couple of more random questions. So it could be dogs are better than cats, strongly agree, disagree, just get people warmed up. Manchester United will win the Premier League, that kind of thing. And then you will ask groups more structured, thought through questions. So for example, in this instance, I asked, the British Library is relevant to young people. And then when people have stood wherever they've decided to stand, you can ask people, why did you stand there? If people move, you can invite discussion around what made them move. Was it something somebody said? So that's a really good activity for a structured consultation. Sticker voting, you might be able to see on the slide there are some post-its, and they've got coloured dotted stickers that people have stuck onto the post-its. So sticker voting is really simple. So you would write at the top of a piece of flip chart a series of questions, and this works on a drop-in basis, so people can drop in and just stick their answers where they want. Can also be used for voting. If people come up with suggestions, you can ask, okay, what are your top 3 favourite ideas on the board, and get people to vote just to narrow your thinking. And then 3, 2, 1 is a good activity to use if, for example, you're developing a project with a group and you're planning on delivering this through a funding application. And this consultation is feeding into that funding application. You can ask 3, 2, 1, which is 3 ideas of things you'd like to do, 3 things you'd like to gain from the process or project. Sorry, 3 ideas you'd like to do, 2 things you'd like to gain from the process, 1 thing that you can offer in terms of skills, experience, and knowledge. And that's really useful because you get an understanding of the types of things people want to learn and their ideas for particular sessions and projects, but also what they can bring to that in terms of their skills. So I did a project where a young person put that they enjoyed and could animate, and animation became sort of key component to the project. And that was because other young people had said that they were interested in digital media. So that sort of became key to our thinking. And finally, drawing journeys. So this is where your pen and paper will come into play. I'm just going to stop screen sharing there for a minute. So what I'd like you to do with your pen and paper is we're going to practically run through this activity. And the reason that this is useful as consultation with communities is it's also just quite a nice activity and conversation starter. Sophie, I will pop in the 3, 2, 1 in the slides that Megan will share. The 3 was 3 ideas, 2 was 2 things that you'd like to gain from the project, and 1 was something that you can give to the project. So skills, knowledge, experience, but I'll make sure I pop them in. So with your piece of paper now, I want you to draw a journey that you have taken recently. So for example, this morning, I went to drop my 3-year-old off at nursery. So I walked there, it's not far from my house. So I'm going to draw my front door and then the pavement outside. And at the side of the pavement, there are some trees. and there are parked cars on this side. I'll just hold that up. So you can see I'm just drawing my journey. So this is my starting point. Sorry, I'm just making sure you don't get the blur. There you go. And then going to draw things that I noticed. So I noticed that there's a lot of parked cars that park on the pavement, which is fine for letting other cars through, but quite often I can't fit through with my daughter at the same time. So I'm going to draw that because that's something that I noticed. There are sometimes a couple of people who I don't know, but I see every single morning on this journey. So I'm going to add them in. And then I'm going to add a dog that we came across until I draw the nursery and the front gate of the nursery, where you ring the doorbell for ages and they take ages to answer, which is fine. But when you're in a rush, it can be quite frustrating. So I've just drawn that really simply there. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes, a recent journey that you've taken. Okay, just start to finish your drawings. Doesn't matter about the detail, just a couple of things that you've noticed. And in a workshop setting, you can spend a bit more time building this up and asking key questions as well, such as what did you see? Did you see anything that's not usually there? What did you notice? Was this the first time that you've taken this journey, and so on? But we'll pause for there now. Is anybody willing to share their journey? Oh, Phil, thank you.
Hi, I know it's always good to have a volunteer. Right, so I'm leaving my house. On the way to the bus stop, there was a couple of people swapping something over on two trucks. Long bus journey, and I see the Wicklow Hills beside me. Get onto the Lewis, and there's a gentleman who gets on the Lewis on a regular. Lewis is the tram system in Ireland. He gets on the Lewis, who's got some mental health difficulties, and I saw him again this morning, so I remembered him. And then I got on a bicycle, and I nearly got caught between two buses. So that's my journey.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Phil. Has anybody got any questions for Phil about the journey? Was it unusual, Phil, did you say? See, was there something you saw that was unusual there, or?
Well, the man on the Lewis was unusual because I was just thinking about him, and then suddenly he appeared. So that was quite unusual. And yes, the nearly getting knocked off my bike by the two buses going in two different directions was pretty unusual as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And was there, apart from the bike incident, was there anything that made you feel uncomfortable, or were you quite comfortable sitting in that journey?
You know, nothing uncomfortable this morning. I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times, and there was nothing uncomfortable this morning. Yeah.
Okay.
Look, I'll be honest with you. I didn't want our friend on the Lewis to sit next to me, because when he sits next to me, there's usually some form of conflict. So there was a little bit of me going, I really hope you don't sit next to me today. But anyway, he's around for quite a bit, so that wasn't too unusual. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So some kind of connection with somebody else was going on there as well.
For sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Phil. Caroline?
Even though I'm an artist, that's a very bad word. So it's a bird, me jumping in my car to get to the station, panicking to try and find the park. There's a fire under my clock trying to get to the train. And then what was unusual about the journey is the guy I sat next to said, "Oh, is that somebody's wallet?" Somebody left their wallet there, but it was a very calm situation. And then it was all very relaxed, and then very busy. Normally when I'm in London, and suddenly it's a very shift that kind of goes from nature to crazy.
We just missed the last part of that, Caroline. Could you just describe the last icon that you drew, please?
Oh, the last icon is it's just a lot of people. So I go from being out in the countryside to being in London, and from a bird to loads of people. Just I feel like I'm in a TARDIS sometimes when I'm doing that journey. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Caroline. I'm just aware of the time, so we'll pause there with that activity. But AJ Isabel has just asked a question. Do you take the scenery for granted as it is so familiar? Possibly. And that's maybe something you could ask participants if you're delivering this activity. And where that can work really well is if you've invited them to a particular place, and if they're unfamiliar with that place, it can be useful to talk through that if it's their first time for attending, or and thinking about the familiar, unfamiliar, the comfortable, uncomfortable. So these are all sort of questions that you can draw out of that activity. And actually, it's just quite nice to be doing something that isn't that just gives people a moment to pause. The other way that you can use a very similar activity to that, such as a drawing and sketching activity, is if you ask participants to think about a user journey. So you might have heard the term user journey mapping, but the way that I use that in a community engagement context is that I will ask people to invent a character, invent a person that lives locally, and they are, if I'm working with, say, a group of young people, let's invent a young person, they're 16, they go to college down the road, yada, yada. And then you can ask them to create a user journey. So it's fictitious, so it takes the participant out of the situation, so it's not personal, but you can use that in different ways. So a physical journey or a journey through a project. So thinking through what are some of the barriers that they could encounter, what are some of the things we need to consider when engaging this young person, and what might happen or change for them through the project. So you can use that sort of mapping activity for that as well. Sorry, I've just got one final slide to share. Try and do this as seamlessly as possible this time. There we go. Oh, it's gone back to the beginning. I'm so sorry. Sorry, everyone. This has been like the clunkiest PowerPointing. Here we are. So I just wanted to touch on evaluation. So when you're doing any community engagement project, reflective practice is absolutely key. So thinking about your process as a practitioner, what's happening, what shifts and pivots have you had to make throughout the process. Inevitably, it requires you to be responsible and flexible. So charting some of that and really learning from it is useful. And then in terms of evaluating projects with groups, this might feed into your question. I think it was Ali, apologies if it wasn't. But thinking about a benchmark, so where are you starting from, and creating a set of outcomes together that you'd like to explore with participants. So where would they like to see the change? For example, developments in skills, developments of new networks, feelings of connectivity. So you can embed evaluation into your community engagement projects. And it could be that you explore things like data collection together. A really key point, though, that I wanted to make was, if you are doing evaluation in a community engagement setting, to review your findings with that group, so it doesn't feel extractive, but that so they are also confident and proud and feel ownership over your conclusions and findings. So that's just something to consider. It might be at a celebration event that you decide to share some of what you've learned through the evaluation, and then ask them for their opinion. Have you got it right, etc. This is a poster that was produced for a project I worked on called Critical Mass, and a designer called Kirsty Hillier asked a group of young people how they would like to disseminate the project findings, and they decided on some sort of poster format that would be suitable for social media, etc. So this is reflective of what the young people wanted to say and how they wanted to share it. So that's useful to bear in mind. I can see somebody's hand up. Did somebody just have the hand up?
Yeah, I did. Sorry, it's my name's Andrew from Eden Court. I thought I'd share something on evaluation. We had a beautiful bit of training on a thing called Fail Space. I don't know how many people have know of it. So David Stevenson came in, and I think he created this project that looks at, especially in the culture sector, our resistance on acknowledging or accepting that things haven't worked out the way that we want to, and the fear that comes throughout that. And it's a really good thing that you can do with your groups as well. So it's almost like giving you permission to aim for the stars, and it's totally okay if you don't get it. Not everything has to be perfect. And it might be something to that people might find really interesting. So I thought I'd share it quickly.
Andrew, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really useful. I've heard of that project, but I'm glad that you sort of made the point there around being comfortable with failure, and that sense of this work is so knotty. It's so knotty. You're working with people and there's so much heart involved that there are going to be aha moments, and there are going to be tough knots that you need to work through. So I think adopting that mindset is so useful. So thank you for that, Andrew. Are there any final sort of comments that people would like to share? I will make sure that you get all the resources, including the one Andrew's just mentioned. I'll drop that into the slide. Thank you so much, everybody. You'll receive a feedback form at the end of the session via email. Please do fill that in, because I read every single comment before I deliver a skill set, and I make sure I try and weave those comments into my sessions. Please do have a look on the website, and also if you've got suggestions for things that maybe we've touched on and you didn't think we went into enough depth, that might inspire the next session, so please do let us know. But thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.